Hello, my name's Mark Humphrey and I'm a professional wildlife photographer, and I've been using Olympus and OM system gear since 2020 for my wildlife photography. I've been using the OM-1 since 2022, and now I've been lucky enough to be testing out the OM-1 Mark II for the last month or so. But should you upgrade to this camera? I'll let you know my thoughts. So to start this off, I have to say I have been incredibly pleased with this OM-1 Mark I. I've never really found myself wanting or needing anything different from my photography. Now, from a video side of things, then that is a different story. But for today, I'm just going to be talking about the stills side of the OM-1 Mark II. So I'm just going to talk through the upgrades to this camera that have made a difference to my photography. First things first, the autofocus. Now, autofocus improvements are quite hard to quantify, and again I'm going to stress that on my original OM-1 I've never really found any big issues with the autofocus. There are maybe two main issues where the Mark I can be improved upon. Number one is subject detection when the subject is behind undergrowth or within branches. Now, I've not found this a huge problem myself because most of the time I wouldn't take the photo at that point. But the Mark II has definitely improved the acquiring of the subject in those tricky situations. And then secondly, with the original OM-1, the autofocus has a tendency, whilst tracking a subject, to take, say, 10 in focus. The focus will suddenly jump off for 3 or 4 frames and then come back into focus. Now, it's not a great issue, but sometimes it can be annoying when you look back at a series of photos that you expect to be completely in focus, and maybe the one with the perfect wing position is just slightly out of focus. And again, whilst it's not perfect, I have seen a bit of an improvement with this Mark II. Onto blackout free shooting. Now, for 99% of my photography, I will use the blackout free, so the SH2 mode on my OM-1. It is absolutely fantastic, and I'm not sure whether I'm ever going to be able to go and shoot or buy another camera that doesn't have that feature. However, the one limitation that I have found with the Mark I is the lowest shutter speed you can go to is 1/320th of a second. For most of your shooting, that is absolutely fine, but there are times, say, if you're under tree cover or it's particularly dark situation, where you want to put that shutter speed lower. And if I want to do that with the Mark I, I'm going to have to go back into normal sequential shooting, and then there is blackout when you're shooting, which again is not a deal breaker, but I don't think that it's something that I want to be doing very, very often. And with the Mark II, you can now go down to 1/160th of a second, which, to be honest, I don't find myself going lower than that very, very often. And the second thing is, for me, I shoot at 25 frames per second almost exclusively. I know for a lot of people that is just too many frames in a second. You create too many photos that look exactly the same. And then with the Mark II, you can now go down to, I think it's 16.7 frames per second and 12.5 frames per second using SH2 blackout free shooting. So if that's something that has always annoyed you, that you can't go lower than 25 frames per second, this has sorted that. Increased buffer size. Now, with the OM-1 Mark II, they have doubled or more than doubled the buffer in comparison to the Mark I. And whilst I've never really had an issue with the buffer size of the Mark I, it is always good to know that you pretty much won't run the risk of filling out the buffer with the Mark II. So there are a few times where it's come in handy. When I was on Mull, I was photographing fishing eagles coming down and plucking fish from the water. Now I can shoot at 25 frames per second for a long time. I can get the whole sequence coming down, even from it up in the air. Another is when puffins are coming into land or just general seabirds. There can often be many birds coming in. So that allows you to shoot, and the likelihood of you filling up that buffer is very low with the Mark II. So those are probably the three main components that have been added to the Mark II that have made the biggest difference to my photography. But there are a few little things that have just helped to the refinement of this camera. The rubberized dials, whilst I never had a huge issue with the Mark I, they are just nicer to use and nicer in the hand. And apparently they've been designed to work better when wearing gloves. Now, I know the weather's not always great in the UK, but it has been summer, so I've not tested it with gloves, but I can definitely see how it would be better. Number two, the removal of continuous autofocus plus tracking as an option. I mean, people might be wondering where it is, but the truth of the matter is, on the Mark I, continuous autofocus plus tracking just never worked properly. And there are myriad videos or articles online saying that the subject detection tracking just doesn't work very well with the OM-1 Mark I. And that was because they had it in continuous autofocus plus tracking. It just wasn't clear enough that to track with subject detection on, it just needs to be continuous autofocus without the tracking. So they've fixed that with the Mark II. Number three, you can now add different autofocus functions to both the shutter button and the AF on back button. So whether you want subject detection on one and just normal single point focus on the other, you can now do that. Number four, apparently the image stabilization has been increased by half a stop, but again, the image stabilization is so good in the Mark I that I've not really noticed it on this at all, but I will take their word for it, and better image stabilization is always a nice thing to have. And at number five, a couple of features that are way more geared towards landscape photographers, and that is the addition of a graduated ND filter built in, and then an improvement to the currently existing live ND filter within the Mark I. So you can now, as has been very well discussed, have a graduated ND filter within the camera. And then also you can go up to an ND 128, I believe. So that is 7 stops of light on an ND filter. So you can really slow down the shutter speeds for things like waterfalls. And that's pretty much the only thing I've been testing it on. But if I did more landscape stuff, I could very much see how that would be very useful. So there you go. I can't really tell you whether it's worth upgrading from the Mark I to the Mark II. Now, there are definitely loads of little tweaks that have been added to the Mark II that just make me prefer using it to the Mark I. The reality is, I am incredibly happy with my Mark I, and if I was to get a Mark II, I'd be wanting to keep my Mark I as a second body. And if I'm not selling my Mark I, the finances just don't end up adding up for me. Now, if there'd been huge improvements in the video side of things, then I almost wouldn't think twice about upgrading. But the problem is there's not been enough of an improvement in the video for me to warrant spending £2,000 or upwards of £2,000 on a new camera. So for now, I won't be buying the OM-1 Mark II. If the price comes down, or when the price comes down, then I will be very tempted. But if you're someone that doesn't own the OM-1 Mark I would probably suggest, if you can afford it, just get the Mark II, because it is a superior camera, just not enough for me to spend £2,000 on. So there you go. Let me know if you do have any questions about the OM-1 Mark II or how it compares to the OM-1 Mark I, and if I can answer it, I will do. If you want to see more videos about OM system, Micro Four Thirds or anything like that, then do drop me a subscription because, as I said at the start of the video, it is my camera system of choice. But for now, I'm going to say thank you very much for watching and I'll catch you on the next one. Cheers.